We're here at the National Association of Farm Broadcasting Convention with David Shirbroun from Boehringer Ingelheim, Professional Veterinary Services. And David, great to talk with you as always. Cattle stress, one of those things that we've talked about a lot, and it's just an important thing to manage in your herd. First off, before we get too deep into it, why is it important to manage that stress for the cattle herd health?
Yeah, so stress is probably one of the biggest enemies there is for cattle. Cattle are definitely creatures of habit, and anything that's out of the norm they don't like. So what happens when they get stressed is their cortisol levels will rise. When that happens, it depresses their immune system, and so that's when they get sick. So that's what we see. The typical shipping fever that usually happens a week or 2 weeks after they get transported weaned. It's more a result of the stress as opposed to the specific bugs that they're actually fighting. So the idea is always try to lower the stress for cattle as much as we possibly can.
So we're looking at those stress signals. I mean, sometimes it's pretty obvious. You might see the scraping, you just might see balking and everything. But there are some factors that are maybe a little harder to notice right away. Mm-hmm. What are some of those prominent factors of cattle stress that producers should be looking out for?
Yeah, so anytime, like I said, cattle like habits, and if they're not doing their normal habits, that's oftentimes a sign of stress. So, if they're not coming up to a feed bunk or just, not coming up to the hay bale or however you're feeding, they're not coming up as fast as typical. That's one of the quickest ways you can really know an animal is stressed. They'll just be a little more lethargic, just kind of laying around a little bit more, not very active, not playing around like some of the animals might be. Look a little duller in the eyes and drooped ears. Now, those are subtle signs that not everybody picks up as easily. And one of the mistakes that producers will sometimes make with seeing some of those more subtle signs are, since cattle are prey animals, if a producer walks up to a group of animals, those cattle are going to be on alert for the most part. And so it takes usually a few minutes of letting those animals settle down to really get a good feel for what's going on with those animals. It can take 5, 10, 15 minutes to let a group of animals settle down to really see how they're feeling. Then they'll really tell you.
So on top of that strategy of, just kind of slowly integrating and making sure that you're getting that work done, what are some of the other strategies you can use to, kind of manage that stress and get ahead of it? I know sometimes, making sure areas are properly lighted indoors, having firm surfaces they can stand on can go a long ways.
Yeah, so animal husbandry, when you look at the beginnings of it, is the essence of decreasing stress. So calm handling of cattle, moving them, not shouting, not shocking them all the time, just nice calm cattle movement. Obviously having good facilities that aren't going to stress them as far as the lighting or surfaces, having good bedding, for where those animals can rest, keep them out of the wind and the rain as much as possible. But, really want to try to make sure we get ahead of the game too. So inevitably those animals will be stressed. So if we can vaccinate those animals prior to that stress event, and when I say prior to stress, I'm talking about, at least 2 weeks, 30 days is best. If you can get a vaccine, 30 days prior to weaning, those calves will be a lot better protected when you actually go to wean those calves after that period of time.
So we know, you mentioned earlier, makes them prone to disease. One of those issues that's kind of becoming more prominent in cattle is that liver fluke. Could you tell us first off a little bit about what liver fluke is and how it impacts cattle?
Yeah, so liver fluke is an internal parasite, so very similar to a brown stomach worm or a homunculus or some of the other internal worms that producers might be accustomed to. And they function the same way. They pretty much decrease the efficiency of that animal. So, decreased weight gains, poorer carcasses, decreased reproductive values, less conception. But those are things that, you don't see unless you're measuring them. You can't look at a cow and see if she's got liver flukes or not. But they will go in and they'll pick those up off the pasture. They will migrate through the liver and they'll destroy the liver. And that's kind of one of the bigger issues that happens with that decrease in productivity is destruction of liver tissue. And then what's happening, what we've seen recently is liver flukes used to be geographical, more in the Gulf Coast or the Pacific Northwest. But because of cattle movement, cattle that came from down south that had liver flukes moving north have actually carried those flukes with them, and they've kind of set up shop now on some of the northern pastures. And we found liver flukes in pastures in Kansas and Nebraska, which nobody thought was possible previously. So
So then when we're looking at the management strategies for those liver flukes, what are some of the top tips to make sure that doesn't become a problem?
Yeah, so I mean, one top tip, the easiest thing to do is just some diagnostic testing to make, if you're worried about flukes or worms, simplest thing is do a fecal egg count test to see if you've either got a high worm load or liver flukes present. Know your cattle source. If you're bringing in cattle from somewhere else, talk with the producers, see what their herd health history was in the past. And that's kind of one of the few ways, and that kind of leads into the biosecurity a little bit as well.
And then, like you just mentioned, that biosecurity, just getting ahead of things is kind of the best way to go about it. What are just some, in general, as we wrap up here, those biosecurity tips for those cattle producers?
Yeah, so biosecurity is key, and it's going to be more key all the time as we're getting more and more cattle movement. And when you get more cattle movement, you get more disease movement as well. So if you're bringing cattle into your operation, try to find out the herd health history of those animals. If you can't, you need to talk with your veterinarian. They're going to be the best source for information, especially based on your geography. But you might need to test for specific diseases, or what's always recommended is just to quarantine those animals you bring into your herd for a period of time before you integrate them into your herd. Don't just buy those cows at a sale barn and bring them right into your herd, dump them off in the pasture with everybody else. That's one of the worst things you can do. So we got cattle movement to try to monitor, but then also people movement. So know who's coming into your operation. And it doesn't matter whether it's a feedlot, it's a cow-calf operation, or a dairy. People can actually track diseases around. And that's one of the things that the swine industry has done a very good job of is monitoring people movement. So if somebody wants to come into your operation, ask them some of the basic questions, where they've been, previously, obviously what their purpose is, and just make sure that they're not tracking in those diseases that you don't want to bring in.
And of course, we've seen on the dairy cattle side of things that avian influenza becoming a little bit more of a problem. And I think you find a lot that sometimes the simple biosecurity measures are the ones that can prove to be most effective on the operation. It doesn't have to be a massive overhaul. It's just do what you can.
Correct. Yeah, very correct. I think what we're experiencing on the avian influenza side in cattle is that it's being moved both by cattle movement, cattle coming from infected operations going to new operations, and then also the people movement as well. There's been some documentation, I think, of workers that work in multiple operations actually tracking it from one operation to another. So those are, two just very basic methods that we can take to try to prevent disease, whether or not it's BVD, common disease, the avian influenza we're dealing with now, or hopefully not a foreign animal disease like foot and mouth, because that would really be a disaster for the cattle industry if we brought that in. So.
All right, David, lots of great information today. For anyone who would like to get in touch with Boehringer Ingelheim, how can they do that?
Yeah, so there's Boehringer Ingelheim representatives all across the country, sales reps. You can always reach out to them. Talk with your veterinarian as well about Boehringer Ingelheim products, or go to cattlefirst.com.
All right, David, thanks again for the time as always, and enjoy the rest of the convention.
Thank you very much. Appreciate being here.